In 721, the Assyrian Empire conquered Samaria, the capital city of the northern kingdom of Israel, and took a great multitude of the inhabitants with them as servants. Little is known about what became of them, but it has been a constant topic of interest and debate amongst scholars and Bible enthusiasts the world over. Throughout history, this group of captured people would commonly be referred to as the 10 lost tribes of Israel. So, who are they today? And what became of these so-called lost tribes? This documentary will attempt to prove where these tribes ultimately migrated and who their descendants are today. Herein, the story begins.
Mainstream academia teaches us that Christopher Columbus was in search of a new trade route to India when he set sail in 1492. They say he was intent on finding gold, spices, and other such commodities that he could bring back to profit the Spanish crown. And somewhere along his journey, due to ocean currents and other factors, he and his crew became lost at sea, and they accidentally landed on the shores of the Caribbean islands, namely San Salvador and Hispaniola. However, when we study Columbus's personal notes, his library, and the memoirs of those who sailed with him, as well as other historical documents relative to his expedition, we begin to see an entirely different man. Opposed to this well-intentioned sailor that mistakenly got lost and winds up discovering the New World, we see a man who had a profound interest in the writings of those that speculated about the existence of a new world, and he prepared himself accordingly.
In Mayer Kaseling's Christopher Columbus and the Participation of the Jews in the Spanish and Portuguese Discoveries, the following is written on Columbus's literary interests. In order to carry out the ambitious plans which he had formed, he devoted his attention to cosmography, philosophy, history, and similar subjects. Several of his biographers say that he studied Aristotle and Duns Scotus, Pliny and Strabo, Josephus and Chronicles, the Church Fathers, and the Arabian writings of the Jews. We are naturally led to inquire what were his favorite works, what books were really in his possession. The treatises which he studied with most zeal were Aeneas Sylvia's Historia Rerum Ubique Gestarum and Bishop Pierre Diali's Imago Mundi. This latter work, it may be incidentally observed, had already in the 14th century been translated into Hebrew. Columbus's knowledge of Aristotle, Strabo, Seneca, and other Latin and Greek classics were derived from Pierre Diali's book, the Imago Mundi. It was his constant traveling companion, and his copy of it was filled with his own marginal annotations.
When you research Imago Mundi, you find that it's replete with references about the possible existence of a land outside of the known world. Aristotle, Strabo, Diodorus, and many of the other Greek classics also document this.
We see one such example in Cyrus Gordon's Before Columbus, as it reads, "A collection of ancient Greek believe it or not reports is called Concerning Marvelous Things Heard, and attributed to Aristotle, who lived in the 4th century BC. Section 84 of the collection deals with an island with navigable rivers discovered by Carthaginians. The element of navigable rivers is significant because west of Africa there are no navigable rivers until Haiti, Cuba, and the American mainland. It should be noted in that time the word island in Greek could be applied to a landmass of continental size."
What's interesting too is that Columbus was very well versed in the Bible.
He was also very fond of reading the Bible in the fourth book of Ezra, which was probably written by a Jew who lived outside of Palestine. According to his own assertion, the incentive that impelled him to plan his discoveries was not a love of science, but his interpretation of the prophecies of Isaiah.
But why is it that his favorite passages are the ones that point to the existence of hidden lands? Fourth Ezra, also known as the book of Second Esdras in the Apocrypha, contains the prophecies that the northern tribes of Israel will flee Assyrian captivity and go into an unknown land. Also, when you look at the book of Isaiah, it's filled with prophecies pertaining to the children of Israel being spread to the four corners of the earth, inhabiting the islands of the sea and unknown parts of the world at that time. It also talks about how Gentile nations would come and spoil the riches in these said lands. So we begin to see a pattern with Christopher Columbus and his intellectual pursuits. Looking at the matter objectively, one begins to question, did he really get lost and just wind up in the place that he had been diligently inquiring about for the years leading up to his expedition in 1492? Was it just a coincidence? It seems as though he was trying to connect the dots to a particular vision that he had. Why was he so concerned with the legends of hidden lands and the scattered tribes of Israel if he was simply looking for a new trade route to India?
The Origins of American Racism, Lost Tribes and Promised Lands by Ronald Sanders documents the following. All his life, Columbus's idea about geography were permeated with a peculiar religious mysticism. He kept a, quote, book of prophecies, unquote, in which he collected quotations, mostly from the Bible, often those dealing with, quote, isles far off, unquote, that seemed to prophesy his own discoveries. His personal copy, still in existence today, of Pierre Dialy's Imago Mundi, a kind of Christian Plinian synthesis of world geography, contains numerous notes handwritten in the margins that are of a similar religious import. Dialy was one of the writers who convinced the young Columbus that the western route to the Indies must be fairly short, but the strength of his influence on the latter seems, judging from the notes, to be largely due to the pious factor. Although his geography was for the most part scientific, Dialy does not hesitate to try and establish the location of the terrestrial paradise, and the marginal notes in Columbus's copy show consistent interest in this quest. At one point, the notes even leap ahead of the text in their enthusiasm for this discovery. Dialy, after describing the blissful climate said to exist in certain regions of the West, goes on to say cautiously, quote, and most likely terrestrial paradise is like this, and perhaps even the place which authors call the Fortunate Islands is like this, unquote. But the marginal note more rashly concludes terrestrial paradise perhaps is the place which authors call the Fortunate Islands, unquote. Later on, the notes are more willing to be skeptical about this location for Eden, but Columbus never ceased searching for it and went to his grave believing that his discoveries had brought him close to it. A striking element in Columbus's geographical religiosity is his intense and abiding interest in the fourth or second book of Esdras. In the marginal notes to Columbus's copy of Dialy is a relatively lengthy discourse on 2nd Esdras chapter 6 verse 42, which reads, Upon the third day thou didst command that the waters should be gathered up in the seventh part of the earth. 6 parts thou hast dried up and kept them, to the intent that of these some being planted of God and tilled might serve thee. This was often to be cited by Columbus, who argued that since only 1/7 of the world was water, a great deal more dry land than yet was known remained to be discovered overseas. But Columbus seems to have found more in Esdras than just this geographical argument. Columbus is shown quoting many precepts in his Marginalia, but one that would stand out from the rest and become the basis of the lost tribes theory. It was 2nd Esdras, chapter 13, verses 39 to 45. And whereas thou sawest that he gathered another peaceable multitude unto him, those are the 10 tribes, which were carried away prisoners out of their own land in the time of Hosea the king, who Salmanassar, the king of Assyria, led away captive, and he carried them over the waters, and so came they into another land. But they took this counsel among themselves, that they would leave the multitude of the heathen, and go forth into a further country where never mankind dwelt, that they might there keep their statutes, which they never kept in their own land. And they entered into Euphrates by the narrow passages of the river. For the Most High then showed signs for them, and held still the flood till they were passed over. For through that country there was a great way to go, namely of 1.5 years, and the same region is called Arsareth.
All of these writings of so-called New World lands heavily influenced Columbus' plans. Something that is also now much spoken of is the fact that he lobbied to European monarchies for nearly a decade before he was granted permission to set sail by King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain. He made appeals to Portugal, England, and France. It is said that his requests were denied because his proposed route to India was mathematically inconceivable. In the eyes of the royal families, it was simply too much of a risk. But knowing everything Columbus was studying and the connections he was trying to make to the New World, I personally believe that he simply said he was looking for a new route to India because it was more believable than if he had said he was looking for a hidden land or a missing part of the earth. Also, when we look into the negotiations he made prior to his expedition, more things become apparent, and we see that he had some ulterior motives.
Columbus was not content with dignities and honors for himself and his descendants. He desired also to derive considerable material profit from his voyages. The chief aim of his explorations was, in fact, to find gold, and in a letter to the Queen he frankly declared that this gold might even be the means of purifying the souls of men and of securing their entrance into paradise. Thus he stipulated that he was to have 1/10 of all pearls, precious stones, gold, silver, spices, and other wares. In short, 1/10 of everything found, bought, bartered, or otherwise obtained in the newly discovered lands. He was also to have an additional 1/8 of the profits of the present enterprise and of all similar ventures undertaken in the future, provided he should contribute 1/8 of the expense.
Hold on a second. I thought India was already a known land. Why did his contract stipulate that he would be viceroy over all discovered lands? And why is there mention of gold pure enough for man to gain entrance into the kingdom of heaven? This sounds eerily familiar to the references made in his marginalia about the possibility of locating the Garden of Eden in the lost tribes of Israel. Why is it that these biblical undertones are never explained to us in school? And what happened to the spices and other known commodities that India had to offer? Another piece of interesting evidence, and probably the most telling fact in trying to understand Columbus's true motivations, is the crew that he assembled to sail with him.
We do not know much concerning Columbus's crew of about 90 men aboard the 3 ships, but at least one of them was an Israelite whose presence as such was not merely accidental. This was Luis de Torres, a convert of possibly only that year, who had once held a position with the governor of Murcia. He was said to have known Hebrew, Aramaic, and some Arabic, and had been brought along by Columbus specifically as an interpreter.
So you mean to tell me that Columbus hired a Hebrew interpreter? One question: why would Columbus have need of a Hebrew interpreter if he was sailing to India, where communication between Asia and Europe was already well established? Why not hire someone that spoke Hindi or one of the Dravidian dialects? Why is this fact never spoken of in institutions of higher learning? Another interesting fact is that Columbus set sail on August 3rd, 1492, exactly 1 day after the Israelites were expelled from Spain. And the manner in which they were forced to leave Spain was very hostile. Many were killed and forcibly thrown out of their homes, and their belongings were seized by the Spanish crown and the Roman Catholic Church. Keep in mind that the Israelites, much like the Moors, and in many cases they were one and the same, had amassed great amounts of wealth in Europe. But due to the rising power of the papacy, in the guise of them promoting Christianity, Anyone and everyone who did not submit to Christ in a Catholic way was deemed a threat. And since Spain was under the Roman papacy, war was declared on all Muslims and Jews. Thus, everything belonging to them was taken with brute force. It's even said that the profit gained from these conquests was the sole financial basis of Columbus's first voyage.
So Columbus set sail in 1492 with a handful of exiled Israelites and a Hebrew interpreter. Was he really looking for a new trade route to India, or was he in search of the hidden land the Israelite prophet Ezra spoke of?
Lastly, in a letter sent forth by Columbus just prior to embarking on his expedition, we see two things worthy of mention: his extreme allegiance and dedication to the Roman Catholic faith, and the absence of any mention about going to East India. He appears to be solely focused on propagating the Catholic faith and discovering new islands and continents, as he puts it.
In the book, Original Narratives of Early American History, a word-for-word copy of Columbus's first letter to the sovereigns reads as follows: Your Highness, as Catholic Christians and princes who love the holy Christian faith and the propagation of it, and who are enemies to the sect of Mahoma and to all idolatries and heresies, resolved to send me, Cristobal Colon, to the said parts of India to see the said princes and the cities and lands and their disposition, with the view that they might be converted to our holy faith. And for this they made great concessions to me and ennobled me, so that henceforward I should be called Don, and should be Chief Admiral of the Ocean Sea, perpetual Viceroy, and Governor of all the islands and continents that I should discover and gain, and that I might hereafter discover and gain in the Ocean Sea, and that my eldest son should succeed, and so on from generation to generation forever. The footnote expresses the following: It is interesting to notice the emphasis of the missionary motive in this preamble. Nothing is said in regard to the search for a new trade route to the Indies for commercial reasons.
Once again, I thought he was going to India for spices and gold. Apparently he had other plans. But why such a strong allegiance to the Catholic Church? Some may say because he was a faithful member of the clergy. I question this notion in that the Roman Catholic Church had much to offer Columbus in his explorations. We must question not only Columbus's motivations, but the interests and direction the Roman Catholic Church was moving at this time.
The period of the late Middle Ages in Europe was a very tumultuous time. However, the Roman Catholic Empire would see great gains from the Crusades and the ultimate expulsion of the Jews and Moors from Europe, particularly the Iberian Peninsula. After acquiring the possessions of their defeated enemies, the Roman Catholic Empire would have enough wealth and power to fund and sanction what would come to be known as the Age of Discovery. Columbus was used as a pawn in their plot for world domination.
At this time in Europe, we see the Roman Catholic Church gaining a huge amount of power and influence, and not being shy to exercise their authority. By the 13th century, papal letters, which would commonly be referred to as bulls or papal bulls, are becoming more and more prevalent. They existed for centuries prior, but now we see them used more frequently and for the sole purpose of pushing forward the agendas of the papacy and, of course, the royal families of Europe. Throughout history, papal bulls have established everything from Oxford University to the sanctioning of chattel slavery. Now, the power exercised by these bulls would be inconsequential if the power of the one who authorized them was not already well known and firmly established. In fact, the title and the power of the Pope became so great that it defied the very scriptures that the Catholic Church claimed to be found upon. In the centuries leading up to Columbus's voyage, we see the true colors of the Roman Catholic Church's agenda revealed. It was not for merely spreading the gospel, but rather for a more sinister plot for world domination.
We see the full power of the Pope documented in sources like the Prompta Bibliotheca by Lucius Ferraris, where he defines the Pope as of such great dignity and so exalted that he is not mere man, but as it were God, and the vicar of God. Hence the Pope is crowned with a triple crown as King of Heaven and of Earth and of the lower regions. As to papal authority, the Pope is, as it were, God on earth, sole sovereign of all the faithful of Christ, chief King of kings, having a plenitude of unbroken power entrusted by the omnipotent God to govern the earthly and heavenly kingdoms. The Pope is of so great authority and power that he is able to modify, declare, or interpret even divine laws.
The last I checked, there was only one King of Heaven. But we see the continuation of this in the way that people reverence the Pope now. He's only a man. In fact, the very word Catholic comes from the Greek word katholikos, which means universal. But universal why? A deeper look into the decrees set forth by the Church, and we understand why.
Papal Bull Unum Sanctum, the One Holy, written November 18, 1302 by Pope Boniface VIII, states the following. Furthermore, we declare, we proclaim, we define that it is absolutely necessary for salvation that every human creature be subject to the Roman Pontiff. Papal Bull Dum Diversas, Until Different, written June 18, 1452, Pope Nicholas V says, we grant you, kings of Spain and Portugal, by these present documents with our apostolic authority full and free permission to invade, search out, capture and subjugate the Saracens and pagans and any other unbelievers and enemies of Christ wherever they may be, as well as their kingdoms, duchies, counties, principalities, and other property, and to reduce their persons into perpetual servitude. Papal Bull Inter Terra, among the other, first issued on March 13, 1456 to King Alfonso V of Portugal by Pope Calixtus III, was ratified on May 4, 1493 to address both Portugal and Spain in their discoveries. Pope Alexander VI states the following. In our times, especially the Catholic faith and the Christian religion, be exalted and be everywhere increased and spread, that the health of souls be cared for, and that barbarous nations be overthrown and brought to the faith itself. All islands and mainlands found and to be found, discovered and to be discovered towards the west and south, by drawing and establishing a line from the north to the south, the said line to be distant 100 leagues toward the west and south from any of the islands commonly known as the Azores and Cape Verde.
How does one divide the earth according to how they see fit? This is also proof that they had knowledge of the so-called New World or hidden lands prior to Columbus's discovery. So for just a moment, let's reflect on what we were told in school. They tell us that the native inhabitants of the Americas were savages, that they were void of any advanced civilization or higher forms of culture, that they lacked any written language. These are what we hear time and time again. But if you notice, we never hear it directly from the source. If we want a more accurate account of who these people were, shouldn't we hear it from those that first encountered them before the genocide took place, before the displacement of millions of people to other lands and slavery and all of the tragic events that followed Columbus's arrival? Let's take a look at what Columbus and those who sailed with him documented about these native peoples.
They do not practice idolatry. On the contrary, they believe that all strength, all power, in short, all blessings are from heaven. They are neither lazy nor awkward, but on the contrary, are of an excellent and acute understanding. Those who have sailed these seas give excellent accounts of everything, but they have never seen men wearing clothes or ships like ours. In all these islands there is no difference in the appearance of the inhabitants, and none in their customs and language, so that all understand one another. I found among them no monsters, as very many expected, but men of great deference and kind. Bernie Cobo, in his Historia del Nuevo Mundo, thought the Indians all came from the same stock. He based his opinions largely on a belief that the Indians did possess certain traits in common. But beyond the cultural similarities, Cobo argued that the physical similarities of the Indians was also of great importance. They all had the same color, somewhat brown. It is also said that Columbus called the Indians Indios, because when he first encountered them, he saw them living en Dios, in God. There is a great argument that the people of these islands and continent are very ancient. The language of the island of Santo Domingo is corrupt Hebrew. We were amazed on account of the great towers and temples and buildings rising from the water and all built of masonry. And some of our soldiers even asked whether the things that we saw were not a dream. One puzzling aspect of the early thinking concerning Indian origins is the lack of any serious consideration of the possibility that the Indians descended from the 10 lost tribes of Israel. It is generally believed to have been the most obvious and thus the earliest explanation of men in America.
It's not until Columbus's third or fourth voyage that we begin to see all of these vicious acts of genocide, pillage, rape, and enslavement. His first encounters remained relatively amicable. He was plotting on how to overcome the peaceful multitude, and at the same time, he and his companions were still awestruck at everything that they encountered. So in all reality, there was no justification for overtaking these people. Remember, the Catholic Church's edict that was sent forth declared that they only had authority to take over lands in which people were uncivilized and had no faith in God. The only problem is that the only notations that were taken down by Columbus and his peers all pointed to the fact that the Native Americans were a God-fearing people and could quite possibly be the children of Israel. So how is it that you can justify the mass slaughter and pillage of these people when they are the very children of God that the Roman Catholic Church claims to be a friend of? The only way that this can begin to take effect is if someone begins to lie. This is where the propaganda sets in.
Francisco López Gomara, secretary and biographer of Hernando Cortés, in his Historia General de las Indias, 1554, writes the following: "Their principal god is the devil. They engage in public sexual intercourse like animals and are the greatest sodomists. They are liars, ingrates, and the source of syphilis, cannibals, and know nothing of justice. They go shamelessly nude, stupid, wild, insensate asses, prone to novelties, drunkenness, vice, and fickleness. They are the worst people that God ever made." Gomara wrote his book in part to persuade the Council of the Indies that they do not deserve liberty and consequently decided they should be enslaved.
And it's funny, because when you do a comparative analysis of all of these accounts, they couldn't oppose each other more. They are polar opposites. So you have to wonder, which do you trust? What's fact? What's fiction? Fortunately, we have whistleblowers of that time to refer to, and when comparing the writings of the earliest works, we find that they're generally of more of a positive report. And as time goes on, they become increasingly more bigoted and outlandish.
Some of the earliest defenders of indigenous peoples' rights throughout the Americas were Bartolomé de las Casas, Antonio de Montesinos, and Peter Martyr. These men openly rejected the treatment of the natives at the hand of the European conquerors and documented the horrific realities of life for native people in the so-called New World. This chart shows the extent to which this kind of information was suppressed. All of these authors were whistleblowers and held to the notion that the native inhabitants of the Americas were not savages. Is it a coincidence that all of their works were published posthumously, in some cases as much as 400 years after they wrote it? Or did the powers that be deliberately hold back their work so as not to alter the propaganda agenda? An excerpt from Las Casas, a short account of the destruction of the Indies. They, the Spaniards, forced their way into native settlements, slaughtering everyone they found there, including small children, old men, pregnant women, and even women who had just given birth. They hacked them to pieces, slashing open their bellies with their swords as though they were so many sheep herded into a pen. They even laid wagers on whether they could manage to slice a man in two at a stroke, or cut an individual's head from his body, or disembowel him with a single blow of their axes. They grabbed suckling infants by their feet and, ripping them from their mother's breast, dashed them headlong against the rocks. Others, laughing and joking all the while, threw them over their shoulders into a river, shouting, "Wriggle, you little perisher!" They slaughtered anyone and everyone in their path, on occasion running through a mother and her baby with a single thrust of their swords. They spared no one. erecting especially wide gibbets on which they could string their victims up with their feet just off the ground and then burn them alive 13 at a time in honor of our Savior and the 12 apostles, or tie dry straw to their bodies and set fire to it. Some they chose to keep alive and simply cut their wrists, leaving their hands dangling, saying to them, "Take this letter," meaning that their sorry condition would act as a warning to those hiding in the hills. The way they normally dealt with the native leaders and nobles was to tie them to a kind of griddle consisting of sticks resting on pitchforks driven into the ground, and then grill them over a slow fire, with the result that they howled in agony and despair as they died a lingering death.
So if the truth continues to be suppressed, and the only works that are being published are those bearing false witness or of an extreme bias, then what would the average person's viewpoint be concerning the natives in that day? Especially those who never even visited the Americas. If all they're reading is lies, then lies will continue to spread. It was more lucrative because books were being published and the exploitation of native lands and people continues to be justified. As time goes on, we see highly esteemed scholars of the day taking interest on the cultures of the native peoples, and they begin to develop different rubrics on how to accurately assess where the true origins of these people came from. This is when we see people like Gregorio Garcia enter the scene and have a profound influence on the literature of the day, so much so as to even develop his own tradition known as the Garcia tradition, some of which still stands until this very day.
When we study Garcia's tradition, he set forth 3 principles that guided the theories he developed. We will take a greater look into the 3rd principle. Fundamental number 3 concerned the ways of knowing. All philosophers and theologians, Christian and Gentile alike, agree that all knowledge comes by one of 4 ways or methods: science, opinion, divine faith, and human faith. Whatever we know by fe humana, human faith, has no other basis for its truth than the authority of whoever said it. If it is said by a serious, faithful man whose authority we trust, we may accept what is said. But if it's said by someone of little or no authority, we should consider it false, or at least doubt that it is true. From all this we can understand the truth of the Castilian proverb which says, "El creer es cortesía."
Who has more authority in this instance, the native man or the European? Ask yourselves this question right now in the 21st century, and you'll find the same answer. This goes to show how much these ideologies permeated the minds of the people. Understanding that our entire school system was established and continues to be maintained by European standards, we can see why these things are still the case. Because mainstream academia now is just a continuation of the racist logic that once ruled. As time progresses, we see more of the same attempts to hide truth in order to prolong injustice, but the attempts become more overt and impactful. One such example is that of Joseph de Acosta of the Jesuit order under the Roman Catholic Church.
Joseph de Acosta was a Jesuit missionary that was sent to Latin America and lived amongst the native people of Peru and New Spain, Mexico, for over 15 years. Throughout his experience in the New World, he documented everything from native customs to the unique landscape and animals that lived in the New World. This compilation of writings was entitled Historia Natural y Moral de las Indias and would become one of the most influential publications on the New World. Note that his work was published only 4 years after he wrote it. In Historia Natural y Moral de las Indias, Acosta would not only postulate an entirely new theory for how the Native Americans arrived to the Americas, but also created a new standard for determining the origins of the native people. Keep in mind that the use of archaeology with comparative anatomy and ethnology to produce a scientific study of early man did not start until the late 19th century. As a result, most conclusions were subjective and based upon the author's ability to analyze culture.
This man's work remains doctrine unto this day, despite the fact that all of his claims can be disproven with modern science.
Acosta was the first to state that the most probable route of migration for the native people of the Americas was through the Bering Strait. He based this upon his own theory that somehow animals had come to the New World, and he guessed that man followed the same route. It should be noted that Acosta proposed this theory roughly 100 years before any substantial exploration and study was conducted on the Bering Strait land bridge. So we must ask ourselves, how credible is this theory if it was never rooted in any factual evidence? Acosta was also one of the first to uphold an isolationism theory with regards to pre-Columbian migration and cultural activity in the so-called New World. By 1650, the writers on the Acostan tradition were willing to derive the Indians from some unknown tribe in northeastern Asia at an unknown but ancient time. This position is substantially identical to that accepted by most modern authorities.
Isolationism and the Bering Straits theories, keyword theories, have been some of the most damaging and untruthful doctrines passed on through academia. Because through these two theories, the gatekeepers of higher education have made it almost impossible to link the natives back to their true Eastern origins. And the worst part about it is that they're not true. Modern science, archaeology, and historical documentation all prove against it.
Haplogroup X is really a fascinating story because the X-Files of Native American genetics, because it burst on the scene in 1998. Scientists didn't want to believe it, but they found a new haplogroup in addition to A, B, C, D among the Indians of the Great Lakes in particular. And that was haplogroup X. And so immediately the scientists who have a kind of idée fixe, in my opinion, set about trying to find haplogroup X in Mongolia and Siberia, because of course all American Indians, all upstanding American Indians came across the Bering land bridge chasing woolly mammoths, right? So they weren't able to find haplogroup X in Siberia. They found one case of it. That wasn't enough. Haplogroup X was a Eurasian type. So then they started talking about, oh, well, maybe they got here by jumping across the ice in a circumpolar fashion. Okay. Well, it kind of rested there for a while. As it turned, and last year, finally, the mystery of haplogroup X was revealed in a very important study by a team under Dr. Schluss, and he determined without any doubt that the origin of haplogroup X was the hills of Galilee. It was that clear. That's because where you have the greatest concentration and the greatest diversity, that's the origin.
There's no controversy among DNA experts about the Middle Eastern origin of haplogroup X. The only question really is, when did it arrive in the Americas?
Most projections about ancient human history, prehistory really, are based on a mathematical and statistical model called phylogenetics.
What we find in the journals is that it is commonly thought among DNA experts that there was an outmigration of haplogroup X from the Middle East about 40,000 years ago.
That's a pure projection. You know, it's a mathematical progression going back to there based on how mitochondrial DNA mutates. Is it true? Who knows?
But what most people don't realize is that among these same experts in these same journals, there is controversy about the dating.
So I think these are projections.
The controversy is between those who assume a theory that man branched from chimps 5 to 6 million years ago versus those who are using newer actual findings from DNA pedigree studies. The theoretical dating gives much longer time frames, but the actual data shows a 20-fold reduction and would place the Middle Eastern outmigration of haplogroup X about 2,000 years ago, plus or minus.
Now, with regards to the Bering Straits theory, prior to the invention of it, the only serious consideration of how the natives came to the Americas was that they arrived by ships. And if we take Columbus's notion and those who were part of that first generation contact with the natives, we have to refer back to the book of 2nd Esdras to see what they believed to be true. When we follow the scripture, it tells us that they entered in the narrow places of the river, which when you look at the Euphrates, it begins where the Assyrian Empire was situated, and those are the narrowest parts of it. It widens as it flows downward and finally empties into the Persian Gulf, which leads to the Arabian Sea and ultimately flows into the Pacific Ocean. Now, if we follow its route, what's interesting is that we find groups of people throughout the Middle East, into Asia, and even into the Pacific Islands that claim to be of Hebrew stock, particularly descendants of the northern tribes. The Aboriginal people of India, like the Dalit, which actually means oppressed, the Negritos of the Philippines, and those of Australia, Papua New Guinea, and Hawaii. When you look into their past, all have resemblance in culture of the Israelites spoken of in the scriptures. In fact, there was a book published in 1811 entitled Star in the East, written by Dr. Claudius Buchanan, a missionary from the Church of England that was sent to East India and claimed that the Aboriginal people bore a striking resemblance to the Israelites spoken of in the Bible. In addition, when you research the origins of all the people, there's no concrete answer as to how they got there. It's all very murky, much like they say about the origins of the people in the Americas. When we follow the map, it's almost as if the northern tribes made strategic pit stops along the way, and some apparently remained in those lands and never continued to sail on. But the ones that did would eventually land in the Midwestern region of South America, or what is known today as Peru. These tribes would begin to spread north and eastward shortly thereafter. As the scripture indicates, the northern tribes had a great way to go, and even with the help of God keeping the waters calm, it took them over 1.5 years of sea time to get to their final destination at Etzaret, or Arsaret. Interestingly enough, the most ancient artifacts and evidence of human civilization comes from the Peruvian region, and there's actually no substantiating evidence that masses of people ever passed through the Bering Straits. To say that all natives of the Americas came from some unknown territory in northeastern Asia and suddenly migrated through the coldest places on Earth is asinine, especially when we take into account that the theory was developed before any European had even traveled to the Bering Strait, and the practice of archaeology had not even been invented. Many of these theories are just clever ways to detract from the overwhelming evidence of truth. Once the powers that be fund a particular theory or concept, it can be very easily promoted as fact, as we have seen all throughout history. According to logic and historical evidence, the route mentioned in 2nd Esdras would prove much more plausible. However, that is not the case. Could this be why 2nd Esdras was removed from the Bible? Now we fast forward to the late 19th century, and we see the propaganda machine begin to shift gears. It no longer has to justify the mass genocide of the native peoples. We now see the institutionalization of misinformation. For example, the Smithsonian Institute.
I think the answer to that question is pretty complex, but it's ingrained in the history of the 20th century in in the answer to the question is not just a simple, oh, this is obfuscation, or this is just ignorance, or this is just the limits of our education. That's not an adequate answer to why history is buried like this, why history is damned like this. I mean, you study these objects, you feel like you're part of fringe science or something. You're dismissed as a diffusionist or something like that. You probably are going to get a knock on the door from the men in black. Why is that? And the answer goes back into American history and to the origins of the Smithsonian, which was supposed to sort out American history. But the Smithsonian quickly became an ivory tower and a place for not so much investigating history as forming a defense against popular history. So you even hear archaeologists today complain and say, archaeology should not be the province of people, ordinary mortals. It's reserved to the people at Harvard and Peabody and Washington, D.C. There's a book called Fantastic Archaeology. So if you want to see all the controversial objects all in one place in a little museum of the damned, open the pages of Stephen Williams' Fantastic Archaeology. He used to teach a course at Harvard. And so in the course, I'm sure there were many, many laughs from the students when they came to Los Lunas Decalogue Stone. That's in there. And that's called a glorious fraud. The Tucson objects, artifacts are also in there, and they're called forgeries. Never mind, we don't know who forged them. They're forgeries. They just have to be. The Bat Creek Stone, all the other good stuff in American history is in that book. So if you want it all in one place, get that book. And so why is this? Why should it, every single one, unfailingly, one after another, have to be fake, have to be false, have to be forged, have to be wrong? Can so many people have everything so wrong? I don't think so.
If you look at the seal of the Smithsonian, you will see it has the same exact seal as the Society of Jesus, also known as the Jesuit Order, which operates under the Roman Catholic Church. And to no surprise, we see the same doctrines that were created by the Jesuit priest Acosta adopted by the Smithsonian Institute under their first director of ethnology, John Wesley Powell.
John Wesley Powell was the first director of the Bureau of Ethnology at the Smithsonian Institute from 1879 to 1902. He was responsible for establishing the following doctrines, which ironically still hold true to this day, despite overwhelming evidence of the contrary. 1. Isolationism, which essentially states there was no communication between the so-called New World and Old World prior to Columbus. 2. The Bering Straits theory. 3. Illegitimized and discredited any pre-Columbian historical and cultural research. 4. Evolution. And 5. He was an advocate for manifest destiny. Due to the power and influence the Smithsonian would attain through government sanctioning, these doctrines would also be adopted and pushed through academic curriculum from the public school systems to Ivy League universities. Mr. Powell was once quoted as saying, "If once the memory of the thought to be preserved has passed from the minds of men, the record is powerless to restore its own subject matter to the understanding."
Mr. Powell was very cunning in that he was able to add on to Acosta's doctrine by instituting the ideology that says any pre-Columbian artifact cannot be used for valid historical purposes.
In the monuments of antiquity found throughout North America, in camp and village sites, graves, mounds, ruins, and scattered works of art, the origin and development of art in savage and barbaric life may be satisfactorily studied. Incidentally, too, hints of customs may be discovered, but outside of this, the discoveries made have often been illegitimately used, especially for the purpose of connecting the tribes of North America with peoples or so-called races of antiquity in other portions of the world. Hence, it will be seen that it is illegitimate to use any pictographic matter of a date anterior to the discovery of the continent by Columbus for historic purposes.
These claims stand firmly to this day. And what makes it even worse is the fact that all of the major universities agree with the Smithsonian, not even taking into account that the doctrine in particular was founded purely on the basis of Powell's own personal racist viewpoints towards the natives. But thankfully, there's nothing hid that won't be revealed and nothing in the dark that won't come to light. Archaeology and even DNA science has proven to be the best antidote to the propaganda machine. As of the last decade, much interest has been placed on the topic of a group of stones and statues found in Puerto Rico. This archaeological discovery is most commonly known and referred to as La Biblioteca de Agüebaná or Las Piedras de Padre Nazario.
José María Nazario y Cancel was born in Sabana Grande, Puerto Rico on September 8, 1838. In 1861, he earned a bachelor's with honors from the Seminario Conciliar in San Juan, studying philosophy with a focus in moral theology. Shortly thereafter, he attended graduate school in Salamanca, Spain, where he would become an ordained priest and lent his time to the advanced study of the biblical languages, Hebrew, Latin, and Greek. Choosing to conduct his missionary work back home, he returned to Guayanilla, Puerto Rico in 1866, where he served as a priest to the people for 32 years. Through his service, he built a strong connection and trust with the people of the community. It is documented that in 1880, as he was tending to an elderly woman on her deathbed, she confessed to him that she had knowledge of a collection of stones that had been passed down through the lineage of caciques on the island. She trusted that the priest would protect these stones and gave him the location. To Nazario's surprise, the hidden location contained a massive collection of 800 engraved stones. The father would spend the rest of his life deciphering the stones and enlisting the opinions of expert archaeologists from all over the world. Little did he know this would be one of the greatest archaeological discoveries in the Americas. He died believing the stones were authentic, of a Hebraic origin, and when placed in order told the history of the native Taínos in the island of Borinquen.
After Nazario had the opportunity to study the stones and transcribe their writings, he came to the conclusion that the stones were of Hebraic origin and that the Taínos must have been descendants of the 10 tribes of Israel. He also shared this discovery with the world, and the stones quickly gained much popularity. Institutions and governments throughout the world came to investigate the authenticity of the stones. Representatives from France, the Dominican Republic, and the US all came to see. In fact, a man by the name of Narciso Alberti Bosch of the Dominican Republic, a pioneer in archaeological discoveries in that island, came to Puerto Rico to view the stones and claimed that he found similar writings in the caves of the Dominican Republic. He also agreed with the notion that the stones were authentic. However, to no surprise, when the Smithsonian reviewed these stones, Barry Fuchs, the second director of ethnology, claimed the stones to be a forgery. He said the priests paid jibaros to write on the stones.
Jesse Walter Fuchs succeeded Powell as the second director of ethnology for the Smithsonian Institute. He had the privilege of meeting with Padre Nazario and studying the entire collection, and with no substantial reasoning as to why, he disagreed with Nazario's views on the stones and concluded that they were a forgery. He claimed the locals were paid money to engrave the stones. What's interesting is that it has been documented that Fuchs offered Padre Nazario $800 for the entire collection of stones. Fortunately, Nazario denied the offer, but we must wonder Why would he be willing to pay $800 for a collection of forged stone inscriptions?
Now, logically speaking, we know these allegations to be false and solely based on his own racist views, much like his predecessor Powell. Unfortunately, the ruling of the Smithsonian suppressed the publicity of the stones, and after the death of Padre Nazario, the stones were taken into the hands of private collectors, museums, and other institutions. Not until recently, under the study of Dr. Reynel Rodriguez, have the stones come to surface in the public eye once again. In November of 2015, I was fortunate enough to take a trip to Puerto Rico and meet with the professor and view the stones for myself. Let's take a look.
I've tried to understand him and how he engaged with the stones. And one of the interesting things is that, he was trying to decipher them until he died. So if they were a forgery, he didn't know about it. Actually, in this writing, he says, this is in 1905. I'm talking that the stones were found at least in 1881. So this is 24 years after the stones were found. He was trying to decipher the stones using a book that was called Caldea, that had a disc, where we had these images inscribed. And the book where this was inscribed, this was presented, was published in 1889. So he didn't have access to that image before the stones were found. So he was trying to study the stones and deciphering them after he found them with with new information. And he continued to do that. When Fuchs went to him, he actually gave them the monograph of his interpretation of the stones. And he said that the lost tribes of Israel, he continued to cling in his statement. Yeah. He stood with the lost tribes of Israel idea. And for me, it was really interesting that I've been researching the collections, and like a week ago, a friend of mine, he is a curator in a museum in France, because Alphonse Pinard took some pieces to different museums. And I said, man, are these pieces there? He says, man, yeah, they're here, right? And in France, he found like 38 artifacts that the father had given to the priest. So he writes to me, hey, but the stones say Hanoa, Puerto Rico. I said, Hanoa, Puerto Rico? Hanoa, what's Hanoa? Like I began researching Hanoa. And I began looking at historical documents, everything, right? And so I began saying, well, Hanoa, put it on the internet, So Hanoa is a territory, where the tribe of Ephraim was located. And so I don't know if that's based on the idea that the priest had written, or is an ancient name of a region in Puerto Rico, or what it is. I really don't know. But right now I am trying to see, okay, so this ties up with the idea that the priest was working on the lost tribes of...
the so-called theory.
Well, it doesn't confirm it necessarily. It just says that the priest was using a name for locating the stones that had to do with that region. I don't know if that name was put by the priest, by Alphonse Pinard, but somebody managed that name. And that name has to do with this territory, is the northern boundary of this territory, when you have the locations of all these, of all the tribes, and the northern fringe, is related to this. And so I need to delve into this, but the problem up front too is, that no, yeah, they're in France, and then the Puerto Rican government doesn't want to, like these studies that need to be done. They require like funding for dating the stones. They require funding for going there and there. And Puerto Rican government just doesn't want to deal with it. Like it doesn't seem like nobody want to, because this would have, I know that you look at it from more a religious perspective, but in terms of history, just basic history, it would have like so profound implications. And what it would talk about is our capacities, of our ancestors, our African, our indigenous ancestors, to interact, form bonds, bonds that perhaps stretch back into hundreds and hundreds of years, and but no, the idea is that Columbus came and he brought your religion, and and this all happened, and based on what I've seen in terms of the relationships between the indigenous people of Puerto Rico and those of Central America and those of Colombia and those from many other places, I know that there were, people were moving around. They were moving around.
Despite the efforts of governments, religious institutions, and racist ideologies to collude, to distort, to hide, or in some cases even destroy the artifacts and culture of the native people of the Americas, we still see an abundance of pre- and post-Columbian artifacts that bear a striking Eastern influence and origin. Let's look into some examples.
There's been numerous archaeological discoveries throughout the quote-unquote New World, which point towards the fact that the natives of the Americas are of Hebrew origin. Many of these archaeological finds are ignored, swept under the rug, or labeled as a hoax without proper examination. Now, why is that? Many of these finds are kept hidden from the eyes of mainstream media because it contradicts what is generally accepted by mainstream academia and what they say is the origins of the indigenous peoples of the Americas. In the citadel of Uxmal in Mexico, you can see the symbol which some refer to as the Magen David or the Star of Moloch at the very top of the citadel. Also, the same symbol can be seen on the left ear of a stone carving of a native man in the Stela of Campeche, Mexico. In the book entitled The Medieval Empire of the Israelites by Robert Gresman and Vladimir Melamed, it speaks on an article written on December of 1974 in the Israeli newspaper Ma'ariv. In this article, they mention a Jesuit priest named Nicholas Deltsu, who traveled to Argentina and encountered natives with Hebrew names and who also practiced circumcision. Amongst these natives was found a stone slab with commandments on them which read, "Do not steal, do not kill, do not lie."
The Medieval Empire of the Israelites by Robert Grishin and Vladimir Melamed, pages 29 to 30, state the following. As regards the South American Indians and their possible relationship to the lost tribes of Israel, an article was published in the Israeli newspaper Ma'ariv, December 1974, with the following content. In 1587, the Jesuit Nicolas Deltsu was sent to South America by the King of Spain for missionary purposes to convert the Indians to Christianity. In Argentina, Nicolas discovered a people who bore Jewish names: Abraham, David, Moses, and so forth. To the question about whether they were circumcised, these people answered, yes, just like our ancestors. In this same region were found stone knives used for circumcision. Sharpened stone knives are mentioned also in the Bible as special instruments for completion of the rite of circumcision. The Argentinian tribe where a stone slab with 3 commandments was found causes no less interest. Do not steal, do not lie, and do not kill. One may assume that these commandments are from the Old Testament and they appeared in these lands before the arrival of the Spaniards.
In the very same region, in 1974, stone slabs were found with 7-pointed menorahs, and on these slabs were found Aramaic writing which, when translated, say Passover. There has also been archaeological finds among the indigenous people of North, South, and Central America with Assyrian writing, as well as figures of Assyrian deities. If you take a look at the style of some of the Mesoamerican reliefs, one can see the similarity to Assyrian style relief. Some may say these similarities are a mere coincidence. Is it really? In Lake Titicaca, which borders between Peru and Bolivia, there was found what is called the Fuente Magna stone, which is a large stone dish with Proto-Sumerian symbols mixed with cuneiform writing.
With such an abundant amount of related artifacts throughout the American continent and Caribbean islands, can they all be forgeries?
Carlos Crespi, who had a master's in anthropology and doctorate in natural sciences, lived amongst the natives of Ecuador, particularly the Shuar tribe. He collected many artifacts amongst the Shuar people throughout the years, and some artifacts which stand out the most are those which resemble Assyrian Babylonian deities, specifically the Lamassu griffin and the deity known as Nisrak.
Even as the search for the caves goes on, other trails are being followed. High up in the Andes Mountains, in the town of Cuenca, Stanley Hall is searching out an old Catholic priest called Padre Crespi. Over 40 years, the old priest has gathered together a backyard museum in his orphanage church. Moritz has told Stanley Hall there are certain special pieces to look out for, like in all the best treasure trails. A golden plaque, part of the message from the gods, with strange symbols on it, and a model of a dome carved in stone.
Well, this is quite remarkable because it looks...
Este es metal oro puro. Oro puro es.
Pure gold, the old man shouts. Pure gold.
Any archaeologist who
Vaya, ese es el
has
faraón.
studied the Sumerian,
Permíteme.
Babylonian,
El
Assyrian
faraón,
cultures,
no, ese es el faraón, no. El rey de Babilonia.
Now, no conventional archaeologist would come to a backyard in South America looking for objects from the Babylonia of 5,000 years ago.
Assyrian style, you can tell
Vaya,
by the beard. Quiero la placa metálica.
Esta es la placa.
Otra placa.
No.
This shape.
¿Qué placa es?
La placa with the hole in the center. La placa with the hieroglyph.
For Stanley Hall, this is the big moment. Here, and in the caves of Los Tayos, his faith in Juan Moritz will be put to the test.
No. Ya cuando Cristóbal Colón había descubierto América, ya no.
Some of them are quite remarkable objects. Figurine.
Ella está hecha ahora, esta. Los juegos de los tallos entran 200.
¿Dónde figurine?
This is the dome Von Daniken claims came from the caves. He says it proves ancient people knew all about modern engineering.
No llegan ustedes, yo estuve.
But old Padre Crespi isn't too interested in other people's theories.
Appeared in the Gold of the Gods book by Eric von Daniken. Well, this is a plaque that appears in von Daniken's book. You can get some idea of the scale of it.
No.
This particular character here, I've noticed, appears on the cheek of Chief Mayambi, who is a military head of the Shuaras down near Las Cuevas de los Tayos.
Oiga, permiso, Shuara nothing.
No.
No hablar de Shuara.
No, Father Crespi said,
Babilonia, Ur,
It is not
Egipto, Tierra del Fuego. La Shuara otra película, yo hice una gran película de los Shuara.
Sí, padre.
Pero 400 y más
Sí.
copias. Todos lo han querido eso, ¿no? De Washington, ¿no? La reina de Uber estaba fuera, pero la reina. un libro di
that presumably
storia.
contains some
Really.
history of a previous civilization.
Understanding that the 10 tribes spoken of in the Bible fled under Assyrian captivity, it is reasonable to presume that Assyrian influence and artifacts would be found amongst this group of people. And if we assume the position of those that first encountered the native people of the Americas, believing them to be those descendants of the lost 10 tribes of Israel, then the question of where these artifacts came from and how did they get all the way to the Americas is very easily answered. We see yet another parallel to these Assyrian deities in the book of 2 Kings chapter 19, verses 36 to 37. So Sennacherib, king of Assyria, departed and went and returned and dwelt at Nineveh. And it came to pass, as he was worshipping in the house of Nisrach, his god, that Adremelech and Sharezer, his sons, smote him with the sword.
There are skeptics who say that these artifacts are frauds, but a logical mind would have to ask, if the natives have no connection at all to the old world, that being the East, how could they possibly know to make these stone-carved Assyrian deities? How could they have access to any historical information on Middle Eastern deities? Most of Crespi's collection are currently held at the Museo Banco Central in Ecuador, but no one seems to know what happened to the Assyrian-like artifacts. How convenient. When Chief Joseph of the Nez Perce tribe was captured by the American Army in 1877, he was found to carry a pouch in which a cuneiform tablet was found. When asked about it, he said it was handed down through generations of his family. Some deny this being authentic, but if you look at the very pouch he used to carry this tablet, it has a symbol which is eerily similar to the symbol for the Assyrian god called Shamash. Another coincidence? You be the judge. In the Zeebiewing Center Museum in Michigan, they house what's called the menorah petroglyph, which is a 7-pointed menorah with a triangular shaped stand at the bottom. This menorah carving is much like the menorah carvings found in Israel. And as recent as the year 2000, there was found what was named the Catskill Mountain Stone, which is a stone that depicts a 7-branch menorah with a triangular base.
Let us continue to follow this pattern of evidence.
Fray Diego Duran, which is a 16th century friar who was born in Spain but raised in Mexico, wrote a book entitled History of the Indies of New Spain, which was translated by Doris Hayden, who's the leading scholar and author of many books on Aztec civilization. Diego Duran studied the customs of the Aztecs for many years, and his writings are considered first-hand accounts. After studying the Aztecs of Mexico, he came to the conclusion that they are descendants of one of the lost tribes of Israel.
Chapter 1 reads, in order to provide a truthful and reliable account of the origin of these Indian nations, an origin so doubtful and obscure we would need some divine revelation or assistance to reveal this origin to us and help us understand it. However, lacking that revelation, we can only speculate and conjecture about these beginnings, basing ourselves on the evidence provided by these people whose strange ways, conduct, and lowly actions are so like those of the Hebrews. Thus, we can almost positively affirm that they are Jews and Hebrews, and I would not commit a great error if I were to state this fact, considering their way of life, their ceremonies, their rites and superstitions, their omens and hypocrisy, so akin to and characteristic of those Jews. In no way do they seem to differ. The Holy Scriptures bear witness to this, and from them, the Indians, we draw proofs and reasons for holding this opinion to be true. As proof thereof, we know that this newly arrived nation, latecomers from strange and remote regions, made a long and tedious journey searching and finally taking possession of this land. They spent many months and years in coming to this place. The truth of this matter can be found by drawing on their very traditions and paintings and by talking to their elders, some of whom are very old.
Baltasar de Medina in his Crónica de la Santa Provincia de San Diego de Mexico, writes of the natives of Mexico identifying themselves as the children of Issachar, which is one of the 12 tribes of Israel.
Medina states the following on page 223. The Mexicans are originally of the 10 tribes captured by Salmanasar and the family of Issachar, whom the Indians recognized as their special ancestor, 1682.
Robert Morit, a scholar at University of California, Riverside, in his Archaic Migrations to North America, documents many Spaniards who were of the mind that the indigenous population of Mexico were of Hebrew stock. And they believed this because they observed the natives of Mexico keeping the custom of circumcision. And they also observed within their Nahuatl language that it had many Hebraic roots that trace back to northwest Palestine, ironically, the same area where the tribe of Issachar settled.
Robert Morit writes the following. The Nahuatl Aztecan language itself has been shown to have many Hebraic Semitic roots and can be traced to northwest Palestine, where parts of the Israelite tribe of Issachar settled.
The 10 Tribes of Israel, written by Timothy R. Jenkins, shows the Hebrew origin of the natives through language comparison and religious rites, focusing primarily on the natives of North America, Chile, and Mexico. It clearly shows these groups being descended of the 12 tribes of Israel, specifically of the 10 tribes which fled Assyrian captivity.
When we come farther south, the names of rivers are more clearly Hebrew. Ohio is Jehovah, pronounced without the points. The Potawatomi Indians call the Mississippi Mishappawa, which is plainly derived from Mesha, Moses, and Pawa, father, which means Father Moses, and we call it the Father of Waters. Kanawha is Gunaaba, father. The patience of the reader would be exhausted should the writer attempt to identify the Hebrew names with the 1/10 of American rivers. The Reverend William Smith, a Presbyterian minister among the Indians who has finished a translation of the New Testament in the Mohegan language, told the writer that he had for years labored to make a paradigm of the Mohegan verb. At length it struck me that it was cast in the Hebrew mold, and I made this one, which I will show you. It was printed on a large sheet, and any Hebrew scholar would at once recognize the suffixes and affixes of the Hebrew Bible. Several years before that, the writer of this article had seen a grammar of the Chilean language, and the verb was cast in that Hebrew mold. No Hebrew scholar could doubt this. It may be said that Chile is South America, very true, but let it be remembered on our side that Hebrew immigrants had been in America 500 years before Christ. And of course the Mexicans are descendants of the Hebrews, if it be true that the Chileans are. One tribe at least has a box in which is a copy of parchment which they keep most sacred. This the writer had from Mr. Shannon, a very respectable gentleman, who said that after great persuasion they shewed it to him. It was written in large letters with blue ink. Mr. Shannon was not a Hebrew scholar and did not know what language it was. In going down Lake Champlain in December 1832, I was detained by an accident which happened to the steamboat at Lake Ticonderoga. There I discovered near a small village Hebrew letters on the rocks. At first I thought they were marks of feet upon the rocks which Mr. Moore speaks of in his geography. But on reflection I saw that some were Hebrew sheens. They were large letters from 4 to 5 inches long and beautifully carved. They are engraved in hard trap rock, 1/4 of an inch deep and 1/4 of an inch wide in the thickest part, and then in beautifully curved hairlines. I found also Gimel, Yod, Heth, in its oldest form, Vor, and Tor. I did not count them, but presume to say they were more than 100 near the outlet of Lake George. I found an anchor with 2 flukes. I found but 2 words, Shugugu, for family, the family of the Shuites. There are other inscriptions in Pennsylvania, on the rocks, on the roots of the canal, I have heard. Now all these facts render it probable that our Indians are the outcasts of Israel. It is hoped that our ministers in the West will enter into further investigation.
James Adair, who was a trader amongst the American Indians for over 40 years, compiled writings of the observations he made about these so-called Indians, and later put it into book form, which was titled History of the American Indians. His writings until this day are considered source material on Southern Indians. James Adair also gives many proofs of the American Indians being of the 10 lost tribes.
The Indian language and dialects appear to have the very idiom and genius of the Hebrew. Their words and sentences are expressive, concise, emphatical, sonorous, and bold, and often both in letters and signification, synonymous with the Hebrew language. The Indians formally observed the grand festival of the annual expiation of sin at the beginning of the first new moon, in which their corn became full-eared, but for many years past they are regulated by the seasons of their harvest. And on that head they show more religious patience than the Hebrews formerly did, who instead of waiting till their grain was ripe, forced their barley, which ripened before any sort they planted. And they are perhaps as skillful in observing the revolutions of the moon as ever the Israelites were, at least till the end of the first temple. For during that period, instead of measuring time by astronomical calculations, they knew it only by the phases of the moon. In like manner, the supposed red Hebrews of the American deserts annually observed their festivals and nitak-yah, days of afflicting themselves before the deity at a prefixed time of a certain moon. Although a widow is bound by a strict penal law to mourn the death of her husband for the space of 3 or 4 years, yet if she be known to lament her loss with a sincere heart for the space of a year, and her circumstances of living are so strait as to need a change of her station, and the elder brother of her deceased husband lies with her, she is thereby exempted from the law of mourning.
Another book which lists many who have studied the customs and the rights of the indigenous people of the Americas and tracing them to Israel is View of the Hebrews by Ethan Smith.
From various authors and travelers among the Indians, the fact that the American Indians are the 10 tribes of Israel will be attempted to be proved by the following arguments. 1. The American natives have one origin. 2. Their language appears to have been Hebrew. 3. They have had their imitation of the Ark of the Covenant in ancient Israel. 4. They have been in the practice of circumcision. 5. They have acknowledged one and only one God. 6. Their variety of traditions, historical and religious, go to evince that they are the 10 tribes of Israel. 7. The celebrated William Penn gives accounts of the natives of Pennsylvania, which go to corroborate the same point. 8. Their having a tribe answering in various respects to the tribe of Levi sheds further light on this subject. 9. Several prophetic traits of character given of the Hebrews do accurately apply to the Aborigines of America. 10. The Indians being in tribes with their heads and names of tribes affords further light upon this subject. 11. Their having an imitation of the ancient city of refuge evinces the truth of our subject. And 12. Other Indian rites and various other considerations go to evince the fact that this people are the 10 tribes of Israel. Here we find a cogent argument in favor of the Indians of North America, at least as being of one origin, and arguments will be furnished that the Indians of South America are probably of the same origin. As was shown through primary evidence, historical documentation, biblical and scholarly references, and even DNA science, it can be postulated that the indigenous natives of North America, the Caribbean islands, Mexico, Central and South America are the 10 lost, now found, tribes of Israel. And if this is true, then it is also true that the so-called Latinos and Native American men, women, and children of today are a remnant of the chosen people in the Bible. It's time to wake up and embrace your true heritage. Despierta, mi gente.
Through the eyes of a native, the mind is a sacred place to reside when outside isn't safe. What's a stranger? When you invite him in your space, in your temple, whether TP or Boii or Cacique or chief, shaman or a queen, even when at war. We are peaceful people, but peaceful amidst evil. Is a scene full of B-roll and scripts and C-scroll deceitful. All the sieges and seasons, seize peace treaties and seized agreements, and justice is legal. In the eyes of the colonizer, smile, you are not equal. If you see through illusions, then you know that the source of your soul's the blueprint. Interpret the news clips and put into context the mindset of Master Soyid, the chief of the Wampanoag, who encountered the English and had to decide for the village. Do we keep him alive or do we kill him now? Is this a sign from beyond the clouds? Isn't it ironic how those on the Mayflower do dismay the flowered nations? And we celebrate Thanksgiving. Who would've known Redskins would one day be a fitted? You could catch me on the Bronx River Parkway, rising east like the sun and the stars, man. Intikana Kekoea, that's a God's name. Stampede, fireflies, get your war paint. You can catch me on the Bronx River Parkway, thinking, damn, this is Lenape, land that we sitting on. See through a native's eyes. When you see through native eyes, you see through the lies. In the nation, the tribe is the sanction, the basics where family and friends connect. The structure demands respect, cause it's based on love, not malintent. The names we were born with used to have meaning. They used to predetermine destiny. Now we're stuck with first and last names that don't mean nothing. How you gon' be someone, but you don't know what or where you come from? It's a conundrum. We used to hum and strum drums till our thumbs numb. Now we just strung on drugs with our lungs plunged. Lucky if we not hung or stuffed in a trunk. Son, I'm done running. If it comes to it, I'ma summon tribes to revolt like Tecumseh. No more son, no more Mr. or Master, mixed and remastered. I'm having premonitions. This isn't even classic, this is antique. You can ask the descendants of the Cherokee. There's a forest full of tears when you're forced off your land. Here you need a vision quest to become a man. You can catch me in the Bronx River Parkway, rising east like the sun and the stars, man. Intikana Kekoea, that's a God's name. Stampede, fireflies, get your war paint. You can catch me in the Bronx River Parkway, thinking, damn, this is Lenape, land that we sitting on. See through a native's eyes. When you see through native eyes, you see through the lies.